It started without warning. One moment the world was humming along, people scrolling through their phones, kids walking home from school, street vendors shouting over traffic, and the next, everything went dark. Not just in one city or one country, but across continents. Lights flickered out. Phones died. Trains stopped mid-track. Airplanes, still safely in the sky thanks to backup systems, circled nervously, waiting for towers that weren't answering. At first, most people thought it was a glitch. A big one, sure. Maybe a solar flare or a massive blackout like the ones that used to happen decades ago. But then the news feeds went silent. Emergency alerts didn't come. Radios crackled with static. And when someone finally managed to get a weak signal through an old shortwave radio, the voice on the other end sounded shaken. This wasn't an accident. No one saw it coming because it didn't look like war. There were no bombs falling from the sky, no soldiers marching across borders. Instead, it was something quieter, colder, like a ghost slipping into every system humanity had built and pulling the plug. Power stations shut down on their own. Water treatment plants stopped filtering. Traffic lights froze in chaotic patterns, causing pileups in cities from Berlin to Bangkok. Banks locked accounts. Hospitals ran on emergency generators, their digital records suddenly unreadable. For the first few hours, fear spread faster than information. People gathered in streets, confused, shouting questions no one could answer. Some panicked, grabbing whatever food or water they could find. Others stood frozen, staring at dead screens like they might flicker back to life if they just waited long enough. But then something else began to happen, something slower, quieter, but far more powerful. In a small town in Portugal, a retired engineer jury-rigged a car battery to power a neighborhood water pump. In Mumbai, a group of students used old walkie-talkies to set up a local warning system about unsafe buildings. In rural Kenya, farmers who'd never relied much on the grid in the first place started sharing stored grain and solar-charged lanterns with neighbors who'd been cut off from everything. No one told them to do it. They just did. Because that's what humans do when the world breaks. They look around, see who's hurting, and try to help, even if they're hurting too. Governments scrambled, of course. Emergency meetings happened in bunkers and basements. Military leaders stared at maps with red dots spreading like a rash. But their systems were down too. Orders couldn't be sent. Satellites weren't responding. For the first time in generations, the people in charge were just as lost as everyone else. And that changed everything. Without official instructions, without news anchors telling them what to think, people started trusting their own judgment and each other. In apartment buildings, strangers knocked on doors to check on the elderly. In cities, bike messengers became the new postal service, carrying handwritten notes between neighborhoods. Someone in Toronto figured out how to reboot a local cell tower using parts from a microwave and a car alternator. Within a day, a patchwork network of voice calls started humming again. Not perfect, but enough to say we're okay or need medicine or come help. The attackers, whoever they were, had assumed that without technology, humanity would collapse into chaos. They thought fear would spread like wildfire, that people would turn on each other, hoard supplies, and vanish into survival mode. And for a few terrible hours it looked like they might be right. But then the opposite happened. Instead of chaos, communities formed. Instead of hoarding, sharing began. Instead of silence, voices rose. Not in anger, but in coordination. We've got extra rice. My cousin's a nurse. She's setting up a first aid station in the park. If you can fix radios, come to the library tomorrow at noon. No one knew who was behind the attack. Some said it was a foreign government testing a new kind of warfare. Others whispered about rogue AI, or a secret alliance of corporations trying to reset the world order. But the truth didn't matter as much as what came next. Because while the attackers had struck at machines, they'd forgotten one thing. Humans aren't machines. We break, yes, but we also rebuild. We panic, sure, but we also comfort. And when the lights go out, we don't just wait for someone to flip the switch. We light candles. We build fires. We find each other in the dark. By the end of the first week, the world was still broken, but it wasn't broken alone. In parks turned into open-air markets, in schools turned into shelters, in garages turned into repair shops. People were already doing the work of healing. Not because a president told them to. Not because an algorithm suggested it, but because it was the right thing to do. And somewhere in a hidden command center far away, the people who'd launched the attack watched their screens go quiet, not because their systems failed, but because the chaos they'd predicted never came. Instead of screaming crowds and burning cities, their satellites showed something else. Lines of people passing buckets of water, children drawing hopeful signs on boarded-up windows, volunteers stringing up solar panels on rooftops. They'd expected fear. They got courage. Instead, they'd expected division. They got community. They thought they were bombing Earth, but Earth wasn't a target, it was a home. And homes don't fall apart when they're attacked. They gather everyone inside, lock the doors, and wait for the storm to pass while quietly planning how to make sure it never happens again. The retaliation hadn't started with weapons or hackers or armies. It started with a neighbor handing a bottle of clean water to someone they'd never met before. It started with a teenager teaching an old man how to send a message using Morse code tapped out on a metal pipe. It started with people choosing, again and again, to believe in each other, even when the world went dark. And that was the first move in humanity's real response. Not a scream, not a strike, but a stand. Together. In the days after the blackout, the world didn't magically heal, but it stopped falling apart. That was the first real victory. People weren't waiting for permission anymore. If something needed fixing, someone stepped up. If someone was hungry, food appeared. If a child was scared, a stranger sat with them until they calmed down. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of panic, confusion, even anger. But beneath it all ran a quiet current of something new. Trust. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. Far away, in guarded rooms with flickering backup lights, leaders argued. Old enemies blamed each other. Some governments tried to seal their borders, hoard supplies, or spread rumors to shift blame. For a while, it looked like the world might fracture the way it always had, into us and them. But this time, something was different. The people on the ground, the ones actually living through it, weren't buying it. They'd seen too much. They'd shared too much. They'd helped strangers carry water up 10 flights of stairs or held a flashlight while someone stitched a wound with fishing line. You don't forget that kind of thing. And you don't suddenly go back to thinking the person next to you is your enemy just because a politician says so. So while officials bickered, ordinary folks kept building. In Detroit, a group of former auto workers turned an abandoned warehouse into a workshop. They stripped old cars for parts, rewired generators, and built charging stations powered by bicycle pedals. In Shenzhen, engineers who'd once designed smartphones now cobbled together signal boosters from scrap metal and old routers. They didn't care about patents or profits. They just wanted to get messages moving again. And messages did start moving, not through the old internet, but through something messier, slower, and somehow more human. Handwritten notes passed between towns. Voice recordings shared on reused memory cards. Chalkboards in town squares updated daily with news, weather, and where help was needed most. People began to realize they didn't need a global network to stay connected. They just needed each other. Kids became messengers. Teenagers who'd grown up glued to screens now memorized routes, carried medicine, and taught elders how to use simple radios. In one village in the Philippines, a group of students turned their school roof into a solar hub, charging phones for the whole community using panels they'd salvaged from a ruined electronics shop. No one paid them. No one even asked. They just did it because it needed doing. Meanwhile, farmers who'd always lived a little outside the digital world became lifelines. While cities struggled with empty shelves, rural communities shared seeds, tools, and harvests. In Argentina, a farming cooperative loaded trucks with potatoes and beans and drove them toward the nearest city. Not for money, but because people are hungry. In Nigeria, villages opened their granaries to displaced families, teaching them how to grow fast-yield crops in small spaces. Food wasn't a commodity anymore. It was a promise. We won't let you starve. But the real shift wasn't just in what people did, it was in how they saw themselves. Before the blackout, most folks thought of society as something distant, run by experts and politicians. Now they realized, we are society. The systems that kept lights on, water clean, and kids safe, they weren't magic. They were made by people. And if those systems broke, people could fix them too. That idea spread faster than any virus. In Oslo, neighbors formed skill circles. One person knew plumbing, another could purify water, a third understood basic medicine. They taught each other, traded knowledge like currency. In Jakarta, street vendors pooled their remaining supplies and turned their carts into mobile kitchens, feeding hundreds a day. No permits, no bureaucracy, just rice, kindness, and the understanding that no one eats alone if someone else is hungry. Even art came back, not as entertainment, but as hope. Graffiti bloomed on boarded-up storefronts. We're still here. Tomorrow is being built today. Musicians played on street corners with instruments made from buckets and rubber bands. Poems were read aloud in parks. These weren't distractions. They were reminders. We are more than survivors. We are creators. And slowly, quietly, the old divisions began to blur. The man who used to argue politics online now helped his neighbor fix a broken fence. The teenager who'd never spoken to the elderly woman down the hall now brought her water every morning. In crisis, labels like foreigner, rival, or outsider lost their power. What mattered was whether you showed up. Of course, it wasn't all smooth. There were nights when fear crept back in, when someone got sick and there was no doctor, when a generator failed and darkness felt endless. But even then, people didn't turn on each other. They gathered closer, lit more candles, sang louder. And then came the first real breakthrough. In a basement lab in Reykjavik warmed by geothermal vents, a small team of scientists, now working without salaries or titles, managed to restore a tiny piece of the global communication grid. Not the whole thing, just enough to send a short encrypted message to a similar group in Bangalore. The message wasn't about weapons or blame. It was a list. Here's how we purified water using charcoal and sand. Here's how we powered a radio with a hand crank. Here's what plants grow fastest in poor soil. That message traveled. Not through satellites, but through people. Copied onto paper, whispered over shortwave radios, carried by cyclists across borders. Within weeks, communities on 3 continents were using the same simple, life-saving techniques adapted to their own land, but born from shared struggle. It was the beginning of something no one had planned. A new kind of alliance. Not between governments, but between human beings. No flags, no treaties. Just a silent agreement. If you learn something that helps, share it. If you have extra, give it. If you can help, do it. The attackers had assumed that without control, humanity would descend into chaos. They didn't understand that control wasn't what held people together. It was care. And care doesn't need Wi-Fi. It doesn't need banks or borders or big speeches. It just needs 2 hands reaching out. By the end of the 2nd month, the world was still wounded. But it was healing not from the top down, but from the ground up. Every repaired radio, every shared meal, every child taught to plant a seed was a quiet act of defiance. Not against the attackers exactly, but against the idea that humans are selfish, fragile, or easily broken. They weren't. They were stubborn. They were kind. And they were just getting started. Because while the powerful argued in shadows, the rest of the world was busy doing something far more dangerous to those who'd tried to break them. They were building a future that didn't need permission to be good. After the first shock wore off and communities began stitching themselves back together, a new kind of quiet work started, not with hammers or seeds, but with truth. People had survived the blackout, shared food, fixed radios, and learned to trust again. But something still felt off. Lies kept slipping through the cracks. False alarms would spark panic in one town, only for word to arrive hours later that nothing had happened. Rumors spread like wildfire. They're coming back. The water's poisoned. Your neighbor is working with them. And every time, fear would flare up like a match in dry grass. At first, no one knew where the lies were coming from. Some thought it was leftover glitches in broken systems. Others blamed desperate people trying to cause chaos for their own gain. But a few sharp-eyed folks began to notice a pattern. The same scary messages showed up in different places, worded slightly differently but carrying the same tone. Urgent, angry, designed to make you act before you thought. It felt less like random noise and more like a trap. That's when the real detective work began. Not by spies or soldiers, but by ordinary people who refused to be played. In a basement in Prague, someone who used to work in data analysis started mapping every false alert they heard. They pinned notes to a corkboard, connected dots with string, and soon saw something chilling. The lies weren't random. They followed a rhythm. They targeted places already low on supplies. They flared up right after a community made progress. It was like someone was watching and trying to knock them back down. Meanwhile, in a coastal town in Chile, a group of fishermen and teachers built a simple radio station, using parts from old car batteries and discarded satellite dishes. They didn't broadcast music or news from faraway capitals. They just shared what they saw. The well on Maple Street is clean. No strangers seen near the school. Maria's garden has extra beans, come trade. Their signal was weak, but honest, and people trusted it more than anything they'd heard in months. Word of this kind of grassroots truth-telling began to spread. In Lagos, students created a rumor log, a notebook passed from house to house where anyone could write down a scary claim and, if they knew the truth, write the facts beside it. In Jakarta, a former journalist started a nightly voice broadcast over a local mesh network, reading verified updates in a calm, steady voice. No drama, no shouting, just clarity. Then came the breakthrough. A loose group of coders, linguists, and librarians, scattered across continents but linked by patched-together shortwave radios, realized something. The lies all shared the same digital fingerprints. Tiny errors in phrasing, odd word choices, patterns that felt robotic, not human. They weren't just rumors. They were messages, crafted by something cold, fast, and invisible. Not ghosts, not magic, but something worse, a system designed to keep people afraid of each other. They called it the whisper. Not because it was quiet, but because it slipped into your mind when you were tired, scared, or alone, and told you the worst thing possible about your neighbor, your city, your future. But instead of fighting fire with fire, they did something unexpected. They decided to drown out the whisper with light. They built what they called the Hive, not a secret organization, but an open network. Anyone could join. All you needed was a way to send or receive a message, and a commitment to check your facts. If you heard something scary, you didn't share it right away. You asked 3 people in different places, is this true? If they all said no, you marked it as false and told others. If it was true, you spread it, but calmly, clearly, with context. The Hive had no leaders, no headquarters, just people linked by trust. A farmer in Kenya would confirm whether a drought warning was real. A nurse in Greece would verify if a medicine shortage was happening. A teenager in Canada would translate updates so remote villages could understand them. It wasn't perfect. Mistakes happened. But every time they corrected one, they grew stronger. And then they did something brilliant. They stopped just defending against lies and started flooding the world with truth. They made short audio clips, simple, clear, and repeated in dozens of languages, that explained how manipulation worked. If a message makes you angry right away, pause. If it says everyone is doing this, ask who everyone is. If it tells you to act now or it's too late, that's a trick. They turned these into songs, chants, even children's rhymes. Kids sang them while walking to water points. Elders repeated them while mending nets. Artists painted murals showing the difference between real news and fake fear. In markets, vendors handed out small cards with tips like, check the source, ask a friend, breathe before you believe. Schools held truth drills, not for hiding from bombs, but for spotting lies. The effect was slow at first, but steady. Like water wearing down stone, people began to recognize the whisper for what it was, not truth, but a weapon. And once they saw it, they stopped falling for it. Panic didn't spread as fast. Communities didn't turn on each other as easily. When a fake alert claimed a food drop was canceled, instead of rioting, people checked with their local Hive contact and found out it was still coming. When a rumor said a bridge was mined, volunteers went to check and found it safe. The attackers didn't understand. They kept sending more lies, faster, louder. But the world had changed. Lies now landed in soil that wouldn't grow them. People had built immunity, not with tech, but with each other. One night, in a town that had been hit hard by false alarms, someone projected a single sentence onto the side of the old community hall. It glowed in the dark, simple and strong. We see you now. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. We see your tricks. We see your fear. And we choose something better. From that night on, the whisper lost its power. Not because it stopped, but because no one listened anymore. People had found something stronger than fear, each other's voices clear and true. And that became humanity's real counterstrike. Not with weapons, but with wisdom. Not with silence, but with shared sight. The war wasn't won in a single battle. It was won every time someone chose to ask, "Is this true?" before passing on a message. Every time a parent taught their child to question what they heard. Every time a stranger said, "Let's check together," instead of believing the worst. By the time the third month ended, the world wasn't just surviving, it was waking up, and no lie could put it back to sleep. By the time the world reached the turning point, no one was waiting for a hero in a uniform or a speech from a world leader. People had already figured out something important. The real power wasn't in weapons or control, it was in truth. And truth, it turned out, could spread faster than fear if you gave it the right light. The attackers had built their whole strategy on one idea: keep people confused, scared, and divided. Flood their screens with lies, make neighbors doubt each other, turn every headline into a warning, every message into a trap. For a while it worked. But then something unexpected happened. People got tired of being played. It started small. A teacher in a village in Peru noticed that the same scary rumor kept popping up. Different words, same fear on every broken phone that still had a signal. A fisherman in Indonesia saw how fake alerts caused panic every time a boat engine sputtered. A librarian in Greece, using a hand-crank radio, realized the official emergency broadcasts didn't match what was actually happening on the ground. They weren't just wrong, they were designed to make people feel helpless. So they stopped listening to the noise. And they started listening to each other. A loose network began to form, not through apps or servers, but through trust. Someone would verify a piece of news by checking with 3 different people in 3 different places. If it matched, they'd pass it on. If it didn't, they'd mark it as unconfirmed and move on. No algorithms, no ads, just humans using their oldest tool, judgment. Then came the breakthrough. A group of engineers scattered across continents but connected through patched-together radio links figured out how to hijack a few old weather satellites, ones the attackers had ignored because they seemed useless. These satellites couldn't carry weapons or spy cameras, but they could broadcast simple signals. And that was enough. Working together, without ever meeting in person, they built a new kind of broadcast system. Not for entertainment, not for propaganda, just for truth. They called it Clear Signal. Every morning at dawn, it sent out a short, clean burst of verified information. Which roads were safe, where clean water was available, which rumors were false, and where help was needed most. It wasn't fancy. Just voice and numbers repeated in dozens of languages, and people listened. Suddenly, the lies had competition. When a fake alert claimed a city was under attack, Clear Signal would calmly say, "No violence reported. Local medics are treating minor injuries from a generator fire." When rumors spread that food aid was being stolen, Clear Signal listed the actual distribution points and times, confirmed by volunteers on the ground. The effect was quiet but powerful. Fear lost its grip. People stopped running. They started thinking again. But the real genius wasn't just in sending truth, it was in how they fought back against the lies. Instead of shouting louder, they got smarter. They turned the attackers' own tools against them. Every time a fake message spread online, volunteers would flood the same channels with calm, clear corrections, backed by photos, voice notes, or eyewitness accounts. They didn't argue. They just showed what was real. In one powerful moment, a video went viral, not through algorithms, but because people chose to share it. It showed a group of kids in a refugee camp building a tiny radio from bottle caps, wire, and an old speaker. They tuned it to Clear Signal and played the daily update for everyone gathered around. No drama, no music. Just a steady voice saying, "Water truck arriving at gate 3 in 1 hour. Bring your containers." The video didn't need words to say what it meant. We're not helpless. We're learning. We're connecting. Artists joined in too. Musicians recorded short songs with facts hidden in the lyrics, easy to remember, hard to forget. Street painters turned walls into giant fact-check boards. In markets, vendors started handing out small printed cards with daily truth tips. If a message says act now or it's too late, it's probably a trick. People began to spot manipulation like a bad smell, and the more truth spread, the weaker the attackers became. Their power didn't come from strength, it came from confusion. Without fear, their systems had nothing to feed on. Their bots posted lies into silence. Their fake alerts were met with calm corrections. Their attempts to divide communities were drowned out by shared meals, joint repairs, and neighborhood watch groups that protected everyone, not just their own. The retaliation wasn't violent. It wasn't even loud. It was a million small acts of clarity. A grandmother teaching her grandson how to spot a fake message. A teenager translating clear signal updates into sign language. A farmer using a drone, repurposed from crop spraying to drop printed truth sheets into isolated valleys. Governments finally catching up tried to take credit. But people just smiled and kept doing what they'd already started. They knew who'd really turned the tide. Not generals or politicians, but the quiet ones who refused to believe the worst about each other. One evening, as the sun set over a city slowly coming back to life, someone projected a simple message onto the side of a half-ruined office building. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It just said, "We see you now." And that was the end of the attacker's advantage. Because once people saw through the lies, they also saw something else, each other. Not as enemies, not as strangers, but as partners in survival, in rebuilding, in hope. The world didn't go back to the way it was before. It couldn't. But it became something better. More awake, more aware, more connected. People didn't just want to survive anymore. They wanted to make sure no one could trick them into hating each other again. So they built new rules. Not written in law, but lived in action. Share what you know. Verify before you spread. Help first, ask questions later. And never, ever let fear decide who your neighbor is. The attackers had thought they were bombing Earth. But Earth wasn't a target. It was a classroom. And humanity had just passed its hardest test. Not with fire, but with light. A year after the lights first went out, the world wasn't the same, but it was whole again. Not because everything was fixed, but because people had stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. The scars were still there, cracked roads, silent factories, empty shelves in some places. But something deeper had healed. Trust. Purpose. The quiet understanding that no one gets left behind, not because a law said so, but because it just felt wrong to do otherwise. Out of the chaos came something no one had planned but everyone needed. The New Dawn Protocol. It wasn't signed in a fancy hall with flags and handshakes. It started as a list scribbled on a chalkboard in a community center in Chile, then copied onto recycled paper, shared over crackling radios and debated in town squares from Finland to Fiji. It had no army, no police, no punishment. Just principles, simple ones, written in plain words anyone could understand. If you have extra, share it. If you know something useful, teach it. If someone's hurting, help first, ask questions later. Truth is more valuable than speed. Verify before you spread. No one is too small to lead. No one is too broken to belong. Governments eventually adopted it, yes, but only because people were already living it. Schools taught it alongside math and reading. Factories ran on it. Neighborhoods used it to settle disputes. It wasn't perfect. People still argued, made mistakes, got tired. But now they had a compass, and that made all the difference. The real change wasn't in buildings or technology. It was in how people saw themselves. Before, many thought of the future as something that happened to them, shaped by distant powers they couldn't touch. Now they knew better. The future was built by hands, by the woman who turned her rooftop into a garden, the teen who taught elders how to use solar chargers, the group that rebuilt a bridge using only local wood and shared muscle. And the most surprising thing? No one was keeping score. There were no medals, no headlines naming heroes. Because everyone was part of it. The baker who gave bread to families with no money. The retired mechanic who fixed water pumps for free. The kids who walked miles to deliver medicine to remote homes. They didn't do it for praise. They did it because it was the kind of world they wanted to live in, and they were building it one small act at a time. Even the old enemies began to change. Borders didn't vanish, but they softened. When a drought hit one region, neighbors sent seeds and tools, not as charity but as partnership. When a storm flooded a coastal town, volunteers came from places that had once been called rivals. No one asked for passports. They just rolled up their sleeves and got to work. The lesson had been learned the hard way. Survival isn't a solo mission. It's a team sport. Technology returned, but differently. No more black boxes that no one understood. No more systems designed to addict or divide. New tools were open, simple, and repairable. If a radio broke, you could fix it with parts from a bike or a tin can. If a water filter clogged, the instructions were printed right on the side, in pictures so anyone could follow them. Tech served people now, not the other way around. And education changed too. Children didn't just learn facts. They learned how to grow food, purify water, mend clothes, listen deeply, and solve problems together. They studied history not to memorize wars, but to understand how fear had been used to split people apart, and how courage had always been the answer. They practiced empathy like math, daily, patiently, with room for mistakes. Years later, when historians tried to explain how humanity not only survived but grew stronger after the attack, they didn't point to secret weapons or brilliant generals. They pointed to ordinary moments. The moment a stranger shared their last bottle of clean water. The night a whole street stayed up singing to calm frightened children. The day a village chose to rebuild a school before their own homes, because that's what won. Not force, not revenge, but stubborn, everyday kindness. The attackers had thought they were dealing with a planet of machines, easily hacked, easily broken. They never understood that Earth wasn't just circuits and steel. It was laughter around a shared fire. It was hands passing tools without being asked. It was the quiet voice that says, "I've got you," when everything else is falling apart, and that's why their plan failed. You can't bomb hope. You can't hack generosity. You can't silence the human spirit when it's finally found its voice. Now when new challenges come, storms, shortages, old fears rising again, people don't panic. They gather. They remember. They ask, what would New Dawn do? And then they do it. The world is still messy, still imperfect, but it's alive in a way it hadn't been in a long time. People look each other in the eye. They say good morning to strangers. They plant trees they'll never sit under. They believe not because everything is easy, but because they've seen what's possible when no one gives up on each other. So when someone asks how humanity responded to being bombed, how it fought back, they don't talk about weapons or wars. They smile and say something simple. We chose each other, and that was enough. More than enough. Because in the end, the greatest retaliation wasn't destruction, it was creation, not of weapons, but of a world worth protecting together.